I heard my wife tell our closest friends, in my own dining room, on our own anniversary, that I was dead weight. Not tired, not slowing down, dead weight. Everyone at that table went quiet in a way I'd never heard a room go quiet before. And I sat there and smiled like a man who hadn't just been gutted in front of 12 people who'd known me for 30 years. I thought that was the worst night of my life. It wasn't even close. At 11 o'clock that same night, my phone rang, and a woman I'd never spoken to in my life asked for me by name. She said she was calling on behalf of my wife's attorney. And in the next 4 minutes, she told me things about my own marriage, my own company, and my own future that I hadn't known an hour earlier, and wouldn't have believed if I hadn't heard the paperwork read out loud in her calm, professional voice. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 66 years old. I build furniture for a living, or I used to build it with my own hands before my hands got busy running the company instead. I live outside Asheville, North Carolina, up on Sunset Mountain Road, in a house I paid off 9 years ago. I always believed that if you worked hard enough, loved hard enough, and showed up for the people who mattered, the people who mattered would show up for you too. I was wrong about that. Not about all of it, but wrong enough that it nearly cost me everything I'd built. This is one of those stories I'll remember down to the smell of the coffee going cold on the table. Let me back up, because you need to understand what normal looked like in my house before I tell you how it broke. I started Combs Fine Woodworks in 1998 out of a 2-car garage on Depot Street, back when Asheville was still mostly mill town and mountain views, before the tourists and the breweries found it. I built dining tables for people one at a time back then, sanded every edge myself, delivered them in the bed of a Ford truck I bought used for $2,200. By 2010, we had a real shop on Riverside Drive, 6,000 square feet, and contracts with hotels from Charlotte to Charleston that wanted custom pieces with real joinery, not particle board with a veneer stapled on. By last year, we had 42 employees, a waiting list 11 months long, and a reputation that meant something in this part of the state. I built that company with sawdust in my lungs and my wife's name on the incorporation papers right next to mine, because in 1998, Diane and I did everything together. Diane Combs, 63 years old. We got married in June of 1991 at a little Methodist church off Marymount Avenue, and for a long, long time, I would have told you it was the best decision I ever made. We raised 2 kids in that house on Sunset Mountain Road. Our son Preston, 31 now, carries the title of Vice President of Sales, though I'll be honest with you, most days that means he answers a handful of emails and takes long lunches with clients who could probably close their own deals. Our daughter Callie is 28. Teaches kindergarten at a school over in Black Mountain, about 20 minutes from us, and calls her mother nearly every day and calls me maybe once a week, usually just to check in, never to ask for anything. I want you to remember that detail. It matters later. 4 months before that anniversary dinner, I had what the cardiologist at Mission Hospital called a moderate ischemic event, a mild stroke, if you want the plain word for it. I was standing at my bandsaw on a Wednesday morning in April, and the left side of my face went numb, and the next thing I remember with any clarity is a nurse named Priya asking me to squeeze her hand. I spent 4 days in that hospital and another 6 weeks in physical therapy, relearning how to grip a pencil the way I used to. I came back to work slower. My speech was fine, my mind was fine, but my right hand shook sometimes by the end of a long day, and I couldn't stand at a workbench for 8 hours the way I did at 40. I handed more of the floor work to my shop foreman, a man named Miguel Ortiz, who'd been with me for 15 years and who I trusted with the keys to that building the way I trusted almost no one else on this earth. I didn't know it yet, but that stroke did something else, too. It gave certain people in my life a calendar and a countdown clock and an excuse. The anniversary dinner was on a Saturday evening in late September, 34 years to the day since that little church off Marymount Avenue. Diane wanted to celebrate it properly, and I want to be fair here, I was glad she did. She invited about 14 people. Our neighbors, the Halversons from down the mountain. Pastor Dan and his wife from Grace Fellowship, where we'd gone for 20 years. My sister Joyce, down from Boone. Preston and his girlfriend Ashley. Callie came alone. She'd broken up with someone that spring and hadn't brought anyone since. And Gary Whitfield, our company's chief financial officer, a man I'd hired 11 years earlier and trusted with every number that mattered to my business, along with his wife Renata. Diane cooked a standing rib roast, the good kind, and set the long table with the china, we only used twice a year. Candles, cloth napkins, the whole production. For the first hour, it was everything an anniversary dinner should be. Pastor Dan made a toast about commitment. Joyce told an embarrassing story about my wedding day that made everyone laugh. I sat at the head of that table with my wife of 34 years to my right, and for a little while, I let myself believe the last 4 months hadn't changed a single thing about my life. Then somebody, I think it was Renata Whitfield, asked how the business transition was going. Innocent enough question. Half the people at that table knew about my health scare, and a few of them had heard, correctly, that I'd been stepping back from the shop floor. Diane set her wine glass down, and she smiled the way she smiles at church, warm on the surface, practiced underneath. "Oh, it's going," she said. "Walter's been such a trooper about it. We're really having to reorganize a lot, though, since the stroke. He's just not able to carry what he used to carry." I nodded, a little uncomfortable, but not alarmed yet. People talk about your health at dinner parties. It happens. I even smiled and said something about how I still had plenty of sawdust left in me. That's when Diane laughed, a small laugh, and turned to Renata and said the sentence I will never get out of my head as long as I live. "Honestly, some days he's just dead weight around here, but we love him anyway." The table went quiet in a way I have never heard a room go quiet before. Not the polite pause after a slightly awkward joke. A real silence, the kind where you can hear the ice shift in somebody's glass. Pastor Dan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Joyce's face changed so fast I actually watched it happen. Callie set her napkin down on the table, slow, deliberate, the way you set something down when your hands need something to do besides shake. I looked at my wife of 34 years, the woman I built a company with, raised 2 children with, buried both of my parents alongside, and she wasn't even looking at me. She was reaching for the serving spoon, refilling Renata's plate, completely unbothered, like she'd just commented on the weather. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because people ask me this all the time. I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, easy sound, and I said, "Well, somebody's got to carry the weight around here, and it might as well be me for once." The table relaxed. Pastor Dan chuckled with relief. Joyce reached over and squeezed my arm. Diane smiled at me, satisfied, like I'd played my part correctly. And underneath that table, where nobody could see it, my hand was shaking, and it wasn't from the stroke. I didn't say another word about it for the rest of the night. I helped clear plates. I hugged Pastor Dan goodbye at the door. I thanked Joyce for driving down. And when everyone had finally gone, I told Diane I was tired, kissed her on the cheek, and went up to bed, where I lay in the dark with my eyes open, running that sentence over and over in my mind. Dead weight, but we love him anyway. I didn't know it yet, but that phrase was the smallest part of what was coming. At 11:14 that night, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Diane was already asleep beside me, or pretending to be. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. I almost let it go to voicemail, figured it was a wrong number or some overnight robocall about my car's extended warranty. Something made me answer it. "Mr. Combs?" A woman's voice, professional, a little rushed. "My name is Patricia Vance. I'm an associate at Halloway and Nash. I'm calling on behalf of your wife's attorney regarding the closing documents for tomorrow." I sat up in bed slow, careful not to wake Diane, and walked out into the hallway before I said a word. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Closing documents for what?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause where you can practically hear someone's stomach drop through the phone. "Mr. Combs," she said, her voice changing, slower now, more careful. "I apologize. I think I may have the wrong understanding of where things stand. I was told you'd already been briefed on the sale terms and the consent signature needed for tomorrow morning's closing at 10 a.m. Is this not a good time?" I stood in that hallway in the dark, my bare feet cold on the hardwood, and I said the only thing I could think to say. "Ms. Vance, I don't know anything about a closing tomorrow morning." "What sale?" If you've been listening for a while, welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. Go ahead and grab something to drink. Get comfortable, because this next part is where everything I thought I understood about my own life started coming apart. Drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Patricia Vance did not hang up on me. I want to give her credit for that. A less careful attorney might have panicked, apologized, and cut the call short the second she realized she'd said too much to the wrong party. But Patricia Vance had spent enough years in family law to know exactly what she'd just stumbled into. And to her credit, she chose caution over cover-up. She asked me one question. "Mr. Combs, are you currently listed as a co-owner of Combs Fine Woodworks, LLC?" I told her yes, 60% to my name, 40% to my wife's, same as it had been since we incorporated in 1998. There was another long pause. Then she said, very carefully, "I think you and I need to have a conversation tomorrow morning that doesn't happen over the phone. And Mr. Combs, I would strongly recommend you have your own attorney present." I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to my wife of 34 years, listening to her breathe, and I thought about every version of the last 4 months I might have missed. The following morning, I told Diane I had an early supplier meeting in town, which wasn't entirely a lie because I did drive into town, just not to see a supplier. I drove to see a man named Ed Sloan. Ed had done some contract work for me years back, nothing personal, just a lease dispute with a landlord on Riverside Drive. He kept a small office off Charlotte Street. No big glass lobby, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a man who looked you in the eye when he shook your hand. I sat across from him and told him about the dinner, about the phrase dead weight, about Patricia Vance's call at 11:14 the night before. Ed listened without interrupting once, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished, he said, "Walter, I need you to assume the worst is true, and let's find out together how true it is." He made 2 calls before I even left his office. One was to Patricia Vance, requesting a formal copy of whatever documentation had already been circulated. The other was to a private investigator he'd worked with for years, a quiet, careful man named Ray Delgado, who ran a small firm out of Hendersonville. Ed told me Ray would need everything I could give him. Dates, names, anything that fell off, even slightly, over the last year. "And Walter," he said, looking at me over his glasses, "I want you to think hard, because in my experience, when something this big is happening, it never starts the week before. It starts months before, and the people involved get comfortable, and comfortable people leave a trail." I thought about my shop foreman, Miguel Ortiz, and something he'd said to me back in June that I'd brushed off at the time. We'd been standing in the finishing room, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that Gary Whitfield had been asking him strange questions about equipment valuations, wanting to know what our lathes and CNC routers would fetch on the open market if the shop ever had to liquidate quickly. I remembered laughing it off, telling Miguel that Gary was probably just doing year-end projections. Miguel hadn't laughed. He'd looked at me steady and said, "Walter, I've known Gary 11 years. He doesn't ask questions like that for projections." I told Ed about that conversation. He wrote it down without comment, but I saw something shift in his expression. 2 days later, Ray Delgado called me into Ed's office with a folder about 1.5 inches thick. He was a stocky, unhurried man who spoke like every word cost him something, and he laid it out for me plain. "Walter," he said, "your wife has been meeting with Patricia Vance's firm for approximately 5 months. The first consultation was logged in April, 11 days after your hospital admission." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. 11 days. I hadn't even finished physical therapy for my grip yet, and my wife was already sitting in a divorce attorney's office. "There's more," Ray said, and he wasn't wrong. Gary Whitfield, my CFO, the man whose wife had sat across from me at my own anniversary table eating rib roast, had been quietly courting a private equity group out of Charlotte called Ridgeline Capital Partners for nearly a year. The plan, as Ray had reconstructed it from emails Ed had subpoenaed through the discovery process once the divorce filing became official, was straightforward and cold. Diane would file for divorce, citing my declining health and diminished capacity following the stroke. As part of the divorce, she would argue that continued joint ownership of the business was untenable given my condition, and push for a court-approved sale of the entire company to Ridgeline Capital, which had offered $2.1 million for a business that, according to our own last appraisal, was worth closer to $4 million once you accounted for the contracts, the client list, and the real estate on Riverside Drive. Gary Whitfield stood to receive a consulting retainer from Ridgeline once the deal closed, along with a finder's fee that Ray estimated at just under $180,000. My wife stood to walk away with the marital portion of the sale, roughly split under North Carolina equitable distribution law, while I, the man who built the company from a 2-car garage, would be left with a minority stake in a business I no longer controlled, run by strangers, or a lump sum settlement engineered to come in low because my own wife's legal filing would describe me, in writing, as a diminished and declining partner unfit to continue running daily operations. I sat in that office and didn't say anything for a long moment. Ed let the silence sit. Then he said quietly, "Walter, there's one more piece, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." I didn't know it yet, but that piece was going to hurt worse than any of the numbers. Ray Delgado slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a printout of a text message thread, obtained legally through the discovery process once things escalated, between Diane's phone and Gary Whitfield's. The messages went back 14 months. I'm not going to describe every line of it to you, because some things a man keeps to himself even when he's telling the rest of the story. But I will tell you the timestamp on the first message that made it unmistakable, not just close, not just careless, but unmistakable. It was dated the night of a company holiday party the previous December at 11:42 p.m., for hours after I'd gone home early with a headache that turned out to be the first small warning sign of what would become my stroke 4 months later. My wife had stayed at that party. So had Gary. I want to be honest about something, because people ask me this constantly in the comments on these kinds of stories. Did I cry? No. I want to be clear about that. What I felt sitting in Ed Sloan's office that afternoon wasn't the sharp, hot pain of a fresh wound. It was something slower and colder, like watching a door close from a distance, quietly, with no dramatic slam, just a click that told you it was locked now, and it wasn't opening again. Ed asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I needed a few days to think, and he respected that. But I also told him one thing I was certain of immediately. I wanted to know about my daughter and my son before I did anything else. I needed to know who else was standing on the other side of that door. Callie called me that same evening, the way she does most weeks, just to check in. She asked how I was feeling, whether my hand had been shaking less lately, whether I'd been getting out to the shop at all. I almost didn't tell her anything. But something in her voice, steady, unhurried, genuinely interested in the answer, made me change my mind. I told her some of it. Carefully, the way you tell a story to someone you don't want to frighten. She went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment, and then she said, "Dad, I need you to tell me everything, right now, all of it, because I am not going to sit here and pretend I don't already know something's been off with Mom for months." It turned out Callie had noticed things too. Small things. Diane canceling their regular Sunday phone calls more often. A new habit of taking calls in the garage with the door shut. A comment Diane had made in July about how Callie's classroom salary wasn't much to build a life on, followed by an odd, almost pointed remark about how important it was to plan ahead financially, because you never really knew what could happen to a family. Callie hadn't understood it at the time. She understood it now. Preston was a different conversation entirely, and I want to walk you through it because it matters for what happens later. I called my son 2 days after meeting with Ray Delgado, and I asked him directly whether he'd known anything about his mother meeting with attorneys back in April. There was a pause on the line, longer than I liked, and then Preston said, carefully, in a voice I recognized from every uncomfortable conversation we'd had since he was 17, "Dad, look, Mom's just trying to protect herself, okay? Given everything with your health, she doesn't know what's going to happen. None of us do, and honestly, maybe it's smart for everybody to have things sorted out clearly instead of just assuming." I asked him a second question. Had he been aware of the Ridgeline Capital offer? Another pause, this one longer, and then he said something I will never fully forget, because it told me everything I needed to know about where my son stood. He said, "Dad, I've seen the numbers on that offer, and honestly, I think it's not a bad deal, given the market, and given that you're not really able to run things day to day the way you used to. I think you should consider it." I sat there, holding the phone, and asked him one more thing, quiet, almost gentle. "Preston, did they offer you anything to keep quiet about this?" And my son, 31 years old, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders through the Biltmore Estate Gardens more times than I could count, said, "Dad, that's not fair," and it wasn't a no. I didn't yell at him. I want you to understand that. I told him I needed some time, and I hung up, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a hardware store on Marymount Avenue for almost 40 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. Over the following 2 weeks, Ed and Ray built the case with a precision I'll admit I found strangely comforting, the way watching a skilled craftsman work always comforts me, even when the subject matter is my own marriage falling apart. Ray confirmed that Diane's 40% ownership stake had been quietly leveraged as collateral in a private loan she'd taken out through a firm connected to Ridgeline, structured so that if the sale to Ridgeline fell through, she would still be personally protected, while I would still be personally exposed. Ed confirmed that Gary Whitfield had, over the preceding 8 months, systematically undervalued 3 separate equipment appraisals submitted to our insurance carrier, likely to make the eventual sale price to Ridgeline look reasonable on paper, a discrepancy that, once documented, amounted to insurance fraud on top of everything else. And Ray, working a separate angle entirely, discovered that Gary had been quietly siphoning small amounts from the company's vendor accounts for nearly 2 years, routed through inflated invoices from a supplier called Blue Ridge Hardware Solutions, a company that, once Ray pulled the state filings, turned out to be registered to Gary's brother-in-law, with a business address that was actually a mailbox rental store off Tunnel Road. The total, once Ray finished reconstructing it, came to just over $91,000 over 23 months. I sat with all of that for a long time, and I want to tell you, the money hurt. $91,000 is not nothing. Not to a man who started his business with a used truck and a garage full of hand tools. But it wasn't the money that kept me up at night. It was picturing Diane sitting in Patricia Vance's office 11 days after I woke up in that hospital bed, already deciding what my declining condition was worth to her in a settlement. There was one bright spot in those 2 weeks, and I want to tell you about it now, because you deserve to know that not everyone in my life had turned into someone I didn't recognize. I drove out to the shop on a Thursday afternoon, told the front office I needed to review some equipment logs, and found Miguel Ortiz in the finishing room, sanding down a walnut tabletop by hand, the way he always did the final pass regardless of what the machines had already done. I told him some of what I'd learned. Not all of it. Not yet, but enough. Miguel set down his sanding block, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked at me for a long moment. "Walter," he said, "I've been watching Gary get cagey about the equipment numbers since June. I told you that. But I didn't tell you the rest, because I wasn't sure yet, and I didn't want to throw around accusations I couldn't back up." He walked over to a locked cabinet near his workbench, pulled out a small notebook, the old-fashioned kind with a rubber band around it, and handed it to me. Inside were dates, handwritten, going back nearly a year. Every time Gary had come into the shop asking questions that didn't add up, every time a delivery from Blue Ridge Hardware Solutions had come in overpriced compared to what Miguel knew the materials should cost from 15 years of ordering the same supplies. I kept my own records, Miguel said, quiet, steady. 15 years, Walter. I wasn't going to let somebody walk in here and take this place out from under you without at least having something written down. I stood in that finishing room and looked at a man who had 15 years invested in a company that wasn't even his, who could have looked the other way, who could have played it safe and stayed quiet the way Preston had, and instead had been quietly building his own record of the truth because he thought it mattered. I told him I wasn't going to forget it. He just nodded, picked his sanding block back up, and went back to work on that tabletop like it was any other Thursday. By the end of those 2 weeks, Ed Sloan had everything he needed. He laid it out for me across his desk on a Tuesday morning, and I remember exactly what he said, because it settled something in me that had been shaking since that 11:14 phone call. "Walter," he said, "you have 3 separate legal problems stacked on top of each other here, and every single one of them favors you, not her. You have marital infidelity documented with timestamps. You have a spouse who initiated legal separation proceedings and consulted counsel about a business sale 11 days after your medical event, which any judge is going to find, at minimum, uncomfortably fast. And you have a chief financial officer who has been committing both insurance fraud and vendor fraud against your company for nearly 2 years, none of which your wife can plausibly claim ignorance of, given her role as 40% owner with signing authority on the very accounts he was manipulating." I asked him what he thought I should do, and Ed leaned back in his chair and said something I've held on to ever since. "Walter, you can burn this down loud, or you can burn it down quiet. Loud feels better for about a day. Quiet wins for the rest of your life." I chose quiet. And here's what quiet looked like. Ed filed, on my behalf, a formal objection to the pending sale, along with documentation of the insurance fraud, which under our operating agreement gave me immediate grounds to freeze the company's accounts pending an internal audit, a right I had as majority owner that neither Diane nor Gary had apparently accounted for when they built their timeline. That froze the Ridgeline closing scheduled for that Tuesday morning, the very closing Patricia Vance had called me about by mistake 11 days earlier. Ray Delgado's documentation on the vendor fraud went, through Ed, to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office, along with a formal referral, because $91,000 siphoned through a shell vendor is not a civil matter. It's a criminal one, and I wanted it handled that way, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted it to be real. I also did something Ed hadn't suggested, something I decided on my own, sitting alone in my truck outside the shop one evening in October. I called Miguel Ortiz and asked him to come by the house. I sat him down at my kitchen table, the same table where Diane had called me deadweight 3 weeks earlier, and I told him I wanted to restructure the company's ownership. I offered him 15%, outright, no loan, no conditions, effective the moment the current mess was resolved. 15 years of loyalty, I told him, is worth more than 15%, but it's what I can offer, and I want you standing beside me in this business for as long as you'll have me. Miguel didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, quiet, in a voice thicker than I'd ever heard from him, Walter, I didn't do any of that for a piece of the company. I did it because you're my friend. I told him I knew that. That's exactly why I was doing it anyway. I called Callie that same week and told her everything. All of it, start to finish, the affair, the fraud, the timeline, the $91,000, the offer from Ridgeline, Preston's answer about the finder's fee. She was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then she said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Dad, she said, I don't care about any of the money. I just need you to know that whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere, and I never was. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to test exactly how true that was, because I had one more move to make, and it required every single person in this story to be in the same room at the same time. I asked Diane to sit down with me on a Sunday evening in early November, told her I wanted to talk about where things stood between us, calmly, like adults, before either of us said anything to a judge. I asked her to invite Gary and Renata over too, told her I wanted to clear the air about some business concerns before they became a bigger issue, since Gary was still, as far as she knew, unaware that anything had been discovered. I told Preston the same thing, framed it as a chance for the family to talk honestly before things got messy in court. And I asked Callie to come, quietly, and to bring nothing but herself. They all arrived that Sunday evening believing they were walking into a negotiation. Diane wore the same composed, practiced expression she'd worn the night of the anniversary dinner. Gary shook my hand at the door with the easy confidence of a man who thought he still had the upper hand. Renata brought a bottle of wine, completely unaware of what her husband had been doing for the better part of 2 years. Preston sat down at the same table where he'd once, as a boy, done his homework under my supervision, and looked at me with the careful, guarded expression of someone bracing for a negotiation he thought he understood the terms of. I let everyone settle in. I poured coffee, and then Ed Sloan, who had been waiting quietly in my study, walked into the dining room carrying a single folder and sat down at the head of the table across from me. Diane's face changed the second she saw him. I watched it happen in real time, the practiced composure cracking just slightly at the edges, the way a windshield cracks before it shatters. I kept my voice level. I want to be clear about that, because people ask me this constantly. I never raised my voice once that entire evening. Diane, I said 11 days. That's how long it took you to consult a divorce attorney after I woke up in that hospital bed. 11 days, Gary, before you started building a case to sell my company out from under me while you and Ridgeline Capital worked out what you'd personally walk away with. Renata set her wine glass down slowly, looking at her husband with an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd worn it myself 3 weeks earlier at my own anniversary table. Gary, what is he talking about? She said, and Gary didn't answer her, because Ed had already opened the folder and started laying documents across the table, one at a time, calm, methodical, unstoppable. The text messages, dated and time-stamped, going back 14 months. The insurance appraisal discrepancies, side by side with the real equipment values Miguel had documented in that worn little notebook with the rubber band. The vendor invoices from Blue Ridge Hardware Solutions, registered to Gary's own brother-in-law, $91,000 over 23 months. And finally, the referral letter to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office, already filed, already logged, dated 4 days earlier. Diane's hands were shaking by the time Ed finished laying everything out. Walter, she said, her voice thin. "Please, we can talk about this. We can figure something out." I looked at my wife of 34 years, and I said the only thing I had left to say to her. "Diane, you called me dead weight at our own anniversary dinner, in front of our pastor, in front of my sister, in front of people who have known us for 20 years. And then you went home that same night and let your attorney's office believe I already knew I was being sold out of my own company. I'm not angry that you wanted out of this marriage. People grow apart. I understand that better than you think. I am telling you, calmly, that I will not let you walk out of it with my life's work in your other hand." Gary tried to speak, tried to reach for some version of the smooth, confident tone he used to talk his way through board meetings, but there was nothing smooth left in the room for him to reach for. Renata stood up first, picked up her purse, and walked out without another word, and I watched something in Gary's face fully collapse when he realized his own wife wasn't going to sit there and help him talk his way out of it. Preston hadn't said a word this entire time. I turned to him last. "Son," I said, "I asked you a question 2 weeks ago, whether they'd offered you anything to stay quiet, and you didn't answer me. I'm going to give you one more chance to answer it now, in front of everyone." My son sat there for a long moment, and then, quiet, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, he said, "They offered me $100,000, Dad, once the sale closed, for not making waves." I just sat there, because I didn't know what to do with all of it. I didn't know how to say no to Mom, and I told myself it wasn't really hurting you, that it was just business. I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, and I said, "Preston, it wasn't just business. It was my life. And you knew that." I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because this is where the sweetness of this story lies, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't tell a story that was only about what I took away from people, because that's not the man I want to be, even after everything. The Buncombe County District Attorney's Office moved forward with charges against Gary Whitfield for embezzlement and insurance fraud, and Gary was terminated from Combs Fine Woodworks effective immediately, his name stripped from every account, every vendor relationship, every piece of paperwork that had ever carried his signature. The Ridgeline Capital sale collapsed entirely once their legal team learned about the pending fraud investigation, which suited me fine because I had never once wanted to sell that business. Not for $2.1 million, not for $4 million, not for any number a stranger could put on paper. Diane and I finalized our divorce 3 months later. I want to be honest with you about the settlement, because people always ask. Under North Carolina law, and with the documented fraud and infidelity on the record, my attorney was able to negotiate a settlement far more modest than the one Diane had originally been counting on when she walked into Patricia Vance's office 11 days after my stroke. She kept the house on Sunset Mountain Road, because I didn't want it anymore anyway. Too many rooms, too many memories of a table where I'd been called dead weight. I kept full ownership and control of Combs Fine Woodworks, restructured, with Miguel Ortiz now holding a genuine 15% stake and a title that finally matched what he'd been doing for 15 years, shop partner and operations director. Preston and I still talk, occasionally, carefully, the way two people talk when trust has to be rebuilt one small, honest conversation at a time, instead of assumed the way it used to be. He's not in the business anymore. I told him, gently, that I needed people around me who I never had to wonder about, and I think, somewhere underneath the shame, he understood that. Callie is the reason I still believe in the good in people, and I want to spend a moment telling you what I did for her, because she is the sweet part of this story, and every story like mine ought to have one. 2 weeks after that Sunday evening at the dining room table, I sat down with Ed Sloan and restructured my will and my personal holdings entirely. I set up an irrevocable trust in Callie's name, funded with the proceeds from the Sunset Mountain House sale I eventually did go through with, along with a 12% ownership stake in the company itself, held separately from daily operations, so that no matter what happens to me, she has something real and permanent that no one can ever quietly maneuver away from her while she isn't looking. I also paid off her student loans in full, quietly, the same week, because when I asked her, months earlier, whether she'd known anything about her mother's plans, she'd said the only thing she cared about was that I knew she wasn't going anywhere. I wanted her to know I'd heard that, and I wanted to answer it the way it deserved to be answered. I still go into the shop most mornings now, slower than I used to. My right hand still shakes a little by the end of a long day, But I stand at that workbench beside Miguel, and we build things together the way we always have. And there is a peace in that shop now that I hadn't felt in a long time before all of this happened, because everyone standing in it actually wants to be there. I think about that anniversary dinner sometimes, the candles, the china we only used twice a year, the sentence that broke something open in me that I didn't know was still fragile enough to break. Dead weight, but we love him anyway. I understand now that she never meant the second half of that sentence at all. But I think about Miguel's worn little notebook with the rubber band around it, and Callie's voice on the phone telling me she wasn't going anywhere. And I understand something else too. Something I don't think I ever would have learned if that phone hadn't rung at 11:14 that night. The people who are actually going to carry you, when it matters, are rarely the ones sitting closest to you at the table. Sometimes they're the ones quietly keeping records in a locked cabinet 15 years before you ever need them, or the ones who call you every week just to ask how your hand is doing, expecting nothing back at all. I'm 66 years old. I've still got sawdust in my lungs and plenty of years of work left in these hands, shaking or not. I built something once out of a 2-car garage and a used Ford truck, and I built it again, quieter and steadier, out of a $1,500 an hour lesson about who actually deserves a seat at your table. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know where you're listening from tonight, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there is always another story here worth staying for. I'll see you in the next one.